Eleanor Roosevelt was born on October 11th in 1884 in New York City. Eleanor would grow up to become one of the most important and beloved first ladies, authors, reformers, and female leaders. Growing up, her father was an alcoholic, and it was a lot on her to deal with that, plus the deaths of both of her parents and one of her brothers before even being 10 years old. Her strict and critical grandmother raised her, and it really impacted Eleanor's self-esteem. In 1899, Roosevelt began her 3 years of study at London's Allenswood Academy. This helped her become more independent and confident. In 1905, Eleanor married her distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR went to Harvard, and then he did his first year of law school at Columbia University. The Roosevelts settled in New York, where Eleanor found herself being controlled by her mother-in-law, Sarah Roosevelt, who was like her grandmother and very critical of her, because no girl was good enough for her son, Franklin. Eleanor raised their daughter and 4 sons there. In 1911, when Franklin was elected to the New York State Senate, the family moved to Albany. 2 years later, the Roosevelts moved to D.C., where Franklin helped Woodrow Wilson's presidency. When World War I broke out, Eleanor volunteered with various relief groups, further increasing her visibility and political clout. In 1819, Eleanor discovered that her husband had an affair with another woman, but really didn't do anything about it. This prompted Roosevelt. Eleanor's role in politics began as early as 1921. Because Eleanor had polio, he needed someone to fill in for him when he couldn't travel for public appearances. Quickly, Eleanor became very outspoken for women, refused secret services, cared about the rise in poverty, cared about relief for coal miners, and had an all African American staff in the White House. Eleanor also had set up a 48-hour work week and labor laws for the youth. Her to get more involved in women's political groups, including the League of Women Voters and Women's Trade Union League. To this day, Eleanor is probably the most active First Lady in history, holding many press conferences, having her daily newspaper column, and having weekly press conferences. This was a very big thing for her. In 1928, FDR decided to run for governor. In 1932, Eleanor Roosevelt became the most politically active First Lady in history, using her popularity to promote her progressive goals. They were in the White House from 1933 to 1945. Eleanor wrote nearly 3,000 articles in newspapers and magazines, including a monthly column. Because of all what Eleanor was doing, this really helped the public's eye on women. This really helped them see that they could do more than take care of the kids and stay in the house. All of this and all of what Eleanor did really helped motivate other women that they could do more. They could be someone. They didn't have to be someone's property. They didn't have to be in the house all day. And this was a really big turning point. In order to make a big step for women, Eleanor banned all male reporters from coming to any of her press conferences. This made newspaper companies hire women so they could have their voices heard and they could say what they wanted to in these papers, giving them a voice. Like I said before, Eleanor really cared about African Americans, and during this time and before this time, most of them voted Republican, and because FDR and Eleanor were very for Democrats, and that's their side, like that's what they affiliated with, most African Americans started to vote and become more Democratic. So that was kind of like, that's why most Democrats today are still African Americans. That's why most African Americans are still Democrats, and this is all because of her.
The Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was passed in Paris in 1948 on December the 10th. We have fostered the observance of this day not only in the United States but throughout the world. The object is to make people everywhere that these are spoken of and emphasized in the Charter of the United Nations. And the Declaration was written to elaborate the rights already mentioned in the Charter, and to emphasize also for all of us the fact that the building of human rights would be one of the foundation stones. All over the world, we've encouraged the associations for the United Nations